Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the live chat. It's so nice to see you again. I have a jam-packed chat tonight where I will talk about sewing tools and I need to clear the sound now. Sorry. So tonight's topic is sewing tools, and basically sewing tools that won't break the bank, budget-friendly things that can be really helpful when it comes to making our own clothes and stuff like that. So please say hi in the chat and chime in with your suggestions. My plan is to first start talking about the tools that I have and I recommend, and some are actually even free, so they're basically household items that can be used also for sewing. And then I would love to hear your suggestions as well, so please chime in the chat to see, so we can build a collective wish list on things that are great for sewing. So hello everyone. Hello Howard and hello Christopher. So nice to hear you again. So just keep the chat going and just chime in if you have any questions or suggestions, or perhaps some point of view that you don't agree with me, just fire away. So I would love to hear that. Yeah, so let's talk about the sewing tools. So I have a big box here of stuff that I have collected, and hi Greg from Florida as well here. So nice to see you. We have a couple of people in the chat already. Lovely. So in my first thing here is actually something that I got from a suggestion that I got from another live stream from Michael, I think, the Sewing Swede. I made a call out for, getting a really good tracing wheel or tracing pen, because that's one of the things that I've really struggled with, because regular pens, they just get so blurry, and tracing wheel, they tend to just mess up everything and they don't really stay put. So I was directed to this, which is the Clover brand, and they are called, I need to read inside here, Chaco liner pen style, and they are tapered points for easy marking. So basically they are like a mix of a pen and a tracing wheel. So there's a tiny tracing wheel, and here's a lot of Tailor's chalk, and I've just tried it on one garment so far, but it draws a really sharp line. So I was really impressed with these ones. So I bought one in white and one in blue, and I think it's a game changer. So if you're like me and really struggling to find that, they look like this, charcoal liner pen style, and these were not expensive. I think they cost about a couple of pounds, perhaps a little bit more. When I'm shopping on Amazon, I'm usually just pressing away. But this one is something I really recommend. So definitely try them out if you want to get good. They do disappear, obviously, because they are chalk. So if you fiddle too much with the fabric, they will disappear. But I tried them on really glossy Lycra sports jersey and used them for marking. They stayed put long enough, at least for my purpose. So that's my tip number one. More people in the chat now. Hello Anne, and hello Cynthia, so nice to see you. We're just keeping it going here, and that was my tip number one, Chaco liner pen style. And if you have another brand that you like, so please tell in the chat. I was also recommending another brand. I just slipped my mind right now what it was. It was something similar. But if you have another brand you like to recommend when it comes to this, just tell me in the comment section. So that was tip number one. And another tip for cheap sewing tools, and this is also a study in how cheap I am, because I have been using a regular seam ripper for opening my buttonholes for as long as I can remember. I wasn't even for the longest time aware that there were any other ways to open your buttonholes. One of the reasons I would say is that, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, but here in Sweden we don't really see much of this particular tool. But then I listened to the excellent episode on buttonholes by CD Mallory, does the podcast Sewing Out Loud. Highly recommend listening if you haven't already. And they were like, you really need to get one of these, which is a buttonhole cutter. And I mean, I've heard of those before, but when they said it, was like something finally hit me, and I figured, perhaps there is actually something to that tool, even though I do have a seam ripper and it works, so I haven't like messed up anything with the seam ripper. So, but I finally gave in and I bought this one. Brand is from Clover and it's 12mm, and so far I haven't actually had any issue with making any buttonholes that are smaller than 12mm. 12mm is for reference about half an inch, so you know. But if it is, you're supposed to, instead of just pushing like this, you're supposed to slant the knife a bit like this and just gently press it. So is it a game changer? Absolutely. I will say it looks so much better, so much cleaner, and also I have a tendency of not upgrading my seam rippers when they get really blunt, so I just forget about that, and well, I had to like if you can relate to that. I have like 5 seam rippers and they are all super blunt, so that should be a tool I should get for myself for Christmas, another seam ripper. But with this really sharp tool, I will say that is much better. So if you haven't already and you're cheap like me, this is worth investing in. This is from Clover brand and it wasn't expensive at all. I know there are some fancy Japanese ones if you want to like go all the way. And oh, now I see someone in the chat who can help me. Kyle. She was actually the one that talked about another tracing pen that is really good. So you can please tell me, Kyle, which brand, what this one, because I was really happy about this one, but you said you had one that was even better. So Kyle, tell us in the chat and I will read it up for you so you can have some options to choose from if you have another, if you don't really like this pen and you're looking for another option, or if you wanted just a second opinion. And hello, Cass and Varuna. So nice to see you. It's nice to see so much people in the chat. So I said, please chime in if you have any questions or if I go too fast and you want to hear more in detail about stuff, because there's so many things that I will just be so focused about, you know, talking about all the things that I want to talk about tonight. But this was tip number 2, getting one of these a buttonhole opener. Probably so many of you already have them, you're like, duh. But I'm a bit slow and a bit cheap, so but when I do buy something and I like it, I'm usually never have any regrets, so it's worth investing in good tools. That makes sense. And Carl said the option, if which is also from the Clover brand when it comes to tracing pen, is called Chaco. I hope that I pronounced that right. So Chaco is another option, and this one was called, I can't remember, it's such a weird word. Chaco liner pen style, or the Chaco. So there are 2 different options if you're looking for a tracing pen. Obviously you can use like those that are erasable in water or disappear by themselves for a while. But what I like about using a classic tracing pen with chalk is that they don't set with iron, because that's one of the problems I think with using other kind of pens, that if they are get in contact with heat, they have a tendency of fixating, and sometimes you don't want to like go away and wash your fabric and make it all wet in the midst of a project. And this one you just can dust off with you know, a cloth or whatever, and it just disappears. So if I can, I prefer to use this instead of the more high-tech tracing options, but obviously there are a lot of different ways. My least favorite is tracing paper, you know, using the old-fashioned tracing paper with the wheel. That's how I learned to trace when I in school, and I get like dark feelings. It's like traumatic for me, because for once, you know, you have to really push the wheel really hard, and secondly, if the tracing color gets in contact with an iron, it fixates, so you won't get rid of it. It doesn't really matter how many times you wash it, and it like messes up the pattern paper because you have to push through different layers. So I don't use that anymore. So I'd use another method, and I will talk about that when I come to, I have another tool that is really good that I use instead of the tracing paper. Do you use tracing paper? I would love to know, because I hope I'm not alone in not really liking that, but I'm sure also that some of you find it really useful. But for me, it's like, I don't ever want to do tracing paper again. Admittedly, I have a few times, but if I have if this is the only option, I prefer to use Tailor tags, I think it's called, when you make little thread markings instead of using the tracing wheel, because it just messes up so many things for me. And Kylie makes a good point about the chalk as well. It can fixate with an iron, so you must do a sample. But as I said, usually it's so easy to remove just with the cloth instead of just having to go to the bathroom or and the sink and just wash it away. So obviously be careful, and I think especially on white fabrics, that's where it gets kind of hairy. I think that's when I had my biggest mishaps when it comes to using different tracings. I mean, I've had like white blouses that I watch, 20 times, and I can still see the remains of tracing color on dots and things like that. Usually not visible from the outside, but it's still a bit bugging. And Varuna says, I've heard that the friction pen disappear with heat, but I haven't tried that myself. Friction pen, have not heard about that myself, but that sounds really interesting. Another thing, perhaps it could be a game changer. And also Gemini says, I use tracing paper, so we are doing definitely on different sides when it comes to that one. As I said, it's probably just me because I've had so many traumatic experience with tracing paper, so perhaps I should learn how to use it properly. But for me at least, I prefer to use different methods. And Christopher says, I've found Tailor chalk in a big lead match pen form and liking it a lot. That's another option that I haven't heard of before, so that's really interesting. So I will try to sort of list every suggestions afterwards if I can get access to the chat, and I will put them in the description section and also on the blog, because it's really valuable information here. And I've also got an explanation now for the friction pen. It will disappear with heat. However, it can reappear once the fabric cools. Wow. That sounds really high tech. I need to check that out. Friction pens. All right. Thank you for the tip, and thank you for explaining more in detail what that actually entails. And Yemeni, who does tracing paper, will want to learn different methods. And I will show you how I do it. And I think it's much better, especially when it comes to using dots. It's a bit different, perhaps, than I used to, but I will try to explain it, which perhaps should bring me to my favorite tool that I use for so many different purposes. And I know I keep harping about this one. I've probably done about 4 blog posts about it, and probably it has been a regular occurrence in my video tutorials as well, but it's nothing special really. It's just a tailor's awl, and this one is just a regular awl. It's a small one, small sharp one, and I will show you now a few different ways on how I use this. So, and that will also show how I use them for dots. So I'm just gonna show you some slides now. So this is how one of the ways that I use an awl, and this I use instead of tracing paper. And what I do is that I pierce hole at the sharp point of the dots, and also on a couple of spots along the lines. And you don't have to worry about ruining the fabric. I've done this on really like thin batiste, thin knit fabrics. Some knits can be difficult because they tend to bounce back, so you can't really see them. But I've never ever had a problem, with sort of ruining the fabric. And the trick is that you put the holes inside the sewing line. So when you're done marking, like doing the tiny dots, you just use the dots as a guide for how to sew the dots, or whatever kind of seams that you are wanting to do. And I know if you're not familiar with this method, this is an industrial method. I have done 1 blog post and 1 video about how I do that, so I will definitely link up in the description section afterwards to that particular video, so you can see how it works in practice. Whenever I talk about it, I do get some questions about not ruining the fabric and everything like that, but don't worry, and with practice you will find it's really easy, and obviously zero risk of getting stuck with color that won't wash away in water. And another way that I use the dot is the awl is for marking holes. This one is a bit of a bigger awl. This is a regular hardware awl, and I use it, for instance, when I'm doing rivets on jeans. I just pierce through with the awl, making a hole. So that's a really easy way to use that. So I actually have two awls, one thin Tailor awl and one thick regular hardware awl. And another way that I use my awl, again, so not having to use tracing paper, is that I use it for marking, for instance, when I'm doing pleats on a pair of trousers, for instance, or a skirt. So I just pierce holes where the seam or the fold should meet, and also at the upper edge of the fold I just cut a little snippet with my scissors, so just a tiny little bit, so just in the seam allowance. So you know, you should, the cut shouldn't go all through the seam allowance. And this really is super effective. And again, don't worry about the holes showing through, because you will hide them inside the seam. That's the trick. And I've had no mishaps. I mean, I've used this method for many years, and I've never had like a pierced hole like dissolving and showing from the outside, because usually it's actually just pushes the threads to the sides. And in fact, you will find that when you're using one of the small awls like this, it's actually sometimes the hole is even a bit too small to spot. So that's another way of using the awl, and I have more suggestions. I will talk about all night. And that is when I'm doing buttonholes, because if you have the advantage of having a sewing machine that does automatic buttonholes, you don't really need to, after you settle on the settings and the size of the buttonholes, you don't have to mark each buttonholes. So using the awl, you just pierce a hole, and then that is the exact point where you start sewing the buttonhole. So this is how I did like over 40 buttonholes on a pair of trousers that was buttoned all the way down. So as you can see, it was really easy. I just pierced the hole, placed the sewing needle where the hole stood, and just let the machine do the work. And finally, another way that I use the awl, and that is to feed fabric, the upper layer of a fabric. It basically mimics a walking foot, and some prefer to use a walking foot. So, but I like this one because it gives me a lot of control. So if you have problems with when you're perhaps hemming and you see that the upper layer of the fabric are starting to drag out a feed, so you will end up with twisted seam, to just gently feed the upper layer, just gently feed it towards the presser foot, and this will make a really flat seam. So I use it for knits, I use it for like slinky materials like sateen, any type of fabric that has that tendency of stretching out when you're sewing. And it's quite common obviously when you're working. I would also use it for you know, soft rayon fabrics, and just use the awl and gently feed it. And it sounds crazy, but you know, you will find like a rhythmic method, and just gently feed it, and you have so much control. With the walking foot, obviously it does what it does, but with this you can just see in real time exactly how much you need to feed the upper layer fabric. So you can just sew for a little bit, readjust, reassess, and then continue. So if you haven't, do buy an awl, and as I said, you can find those in hardware stores as well, so they're not really like have to be expensive. But this one is a Tailor awl, but again, a very cheap tool, so I definitely recommend that. So I will link up to that, and also done I think about 4 blog posts about different ways to use or with some of the images I showed you. So I will link that again in the description section, so you can go back and check that afterwards. So that was another tool that I really like. And speaking about being cheap, which I am sometimes, another thing that I for many years resisted buying was pattern weights. which I used kitchen magnets. And if you know anything, if you have any experience with kitchen magnets, you know that kitchen magnets doesn't actually weigh anything. They're really light. They just look like pattern weights. So that was what I was using, and obviously with dismal result because the fabric and the pattern kept slipping. So I was recommended buying metal washers, and these are just regular hardware metal washers. The trick is to buy washers that are thicker, so they actually weigh something. And when I looked in a local hardware store here in Sweden, the only big size washers they had were so thin, so they didn't do the job. So I ended having to buy these washers off Amazon. But I'm sure that if most people were probably able to find this locally, I was just too lazy to just. It's so much easier to buy online now than, you know, spending half a day running around town looking for heavy duty washers. But these are fantastic. They are really, really good, and obviously really cheap. So they have made my life so much easier, and they just have the perfect amount of weight, and they come in different sizes. I think some prefer bigger ones, but I don't really. I like mine to be quite small, so I can put them like close to the edge. So I'm really curious about what you use for fabric weights, if you use dedicated fabric weights or if you have some kind of DIY solution like this one. But I highly recommend getting washers. And if you're wondering about the thickness of them, it's about, I would say, 5 millimeters, which is like it's slightly less than 1/4 of an inch. So that's probably what you need to look for. So not the kind of thin, flimsy washers that you usually find, but highly recommended. And Mary Kelly gives a good suggestions also. If you only can find those flimsy washers, glue them together. Excellent suggestion, Mary. That's something that is obviously a way to do it yourself as well, because I don't think they're too expensive in hardware. So they weren't expensive when I bought them at Amazon, and I had to ship them from England. So I couldn't even find them here in Sweden. And also because I usually use, why I need pattern weights instead of in pins is because I use a rotary cutter, so I don't really use a scissor much. And I would strongly advise against using too many pins when you are cutting out patterns, fabrics, because they tend to distort the fabric. So especially the underlayers, because you have the pin, it creates a little bit of a fold. So when you remove the pin after you cut the fabric, you will probably notice that it will end up going outside the actual cut pattern. So at least that's the case for me. Perhaps there are some needles that are better than others, but I would strongly advise to start using pattern weights instead of pins, even if you're just using a scissor. I'm sure many of you already do that, but if you're like me and didn't use proper pattern weights for a long time, it's definitely something I recommend that you look into. And we got some great suggestions here for pattern weights from the comment section. Candle holders, that's a great option. And this one is even better. Cass said, I'm ashamed to say I often use my kettlebells, 12 kilo. No, that is heavy duty pattern weights. These washers have nothing on kettlebells. So if you're into working out, and I would probably say that regular weight plates as well. I mean, the smaller ones, they're about, I think about 1 kilo, or about, let me see here, half a pound, 1 pound plates, they will probably work as well. So you can definitely probably just look in your own household, but don't use kitchen magnets that I did, because they're useless. But your suggestions with kettlebells and candle holders, that sounds a lot better. So that was another tip, and now I have some household items that I want to talk about and that I use for sewing. And the first one is this. Yes, I'm playing with fire now. Hopefully that won't get me banned from YouTube. But having a lighter, I always have a lighter, or is it called lighter, right? You have to correct me if I'm saying it wrong. Zip lighter or a lighter in my sewing toolbox. And why do I use fire? Well, I have two primary reasons for using that. The first one is the classic one, and that is to use it to determinate the fiber content of the fabric if you're unsure, because usually a lot of fabric stores, and especially if you buy online, you're not really sure about the actual fabric content, and different fibers behave very differently when they are set on fire. So synthetics will usually melt, and wool will smell like burnt hair, for instance. And there are a lot of different variations. Most sewing books, at least the older sewing books, has usually a chart that explains all these behaviors. So that's a tip number one for using a lighter. And my second tips for using a fire when you are sewing is that it's really great for melting things. And a lot of notions that we use are made of polyester and plastic, basically, and they melt very nicely when they are in contact with heat. It can be heartbreaking if you're using an iron that is too hot. That happened to me recently. I managed to melt basically synthetic ribbing. Not fun. But you can also use it to your advantage, and I use it primarily for closing zippers. Most zippers, not all, but most zippers are made of plastic these days, and if you're having to, you know, shorten them, for instance, and remove the stoppers, and also if you find that they are like fraying a little bit, just gently burn them at the edges, and that will melt everything, and it will melt the zipper coils. So if you're lucky, they can actually work as a substitute for the stoppers, and it will make it so much more difficult for the I can't think of the term now, but the thing that you drag your zipper up and down with, the handle, or what it's called, from slipping out if you had to remove the stopper. So I use that as well. And also when I'm doing, for instance, like drawstrings and cords for jackets and hoodies, those kind of they are not always used doing they're not always made of natural materials. They're quite common that they are made of synthetic fibers, and so I like to seal the threads off a little bit just by gently again melting them, so they won't fray. So you have to be careful, because obviously you need to check first, because they can be a mix of content and do behave differently even if they are synthetic materials. So sometimes you might have setting a cord on fire, and that's not the purpose of this. But I definitely recommend that you have a lighter close by, and obviously it won't cost you a penny, especially if you get one for free. Yeah, and the explanation, the zipper pull, yeah, that's the one. So this, just melting the zipper coils will keep the pulls from. And I will give you another, if you want to, if just setting the zipper coils on fire or melting them won't help, I will give you another tip to create a full stopper. And what you do is you take polyester thread, preferably the one that is thicker, top stitching thread, or in Sweden it's called bear thread. I'm not sure what it's called in other countries. So you just sew a couple of layers where you want the stoppers to be. You can hand stitch, just sew around like this, and then you bring out the lighter again and you melt it, and this will turn the polyester thread into a plastic blob, and this will actually work as a stopper. It won't be as pretty as a real stopper, but I've used it several times, and if you use matching threads, it actually can look quite nice. So that can be an option to try. And also, of course, be careful when you're playing with fire. I don't want to sort of encourage any risky behavior now, and being careless with fire. But as I said, it's a good tool to have handy. So let's move on to the next thing. And this is something that is super common, at least here in Scandinavia. And when you have home economics or basically what is called sewing class in school when you're a child, you learn that this is a tool that is called Pfiffikus. I think it's German, and I haven't studied German, so my apologies in advance. But this is a seam gauze. Okay, now I will pronounce it really awful. Seam go. Oh, sorry, it's so embarrassing. But you know what I mean. It's a measurement tool that has several different measurements in one piece of equipment. So for this one, this seam gauze has 4 different sizes. And what I really like about this one is that I made a metal. Sometimes you can find these in plastic as well, but I much prefer the metal ones. And you can also, a good thing about using a metal tool is that it obviously resists heat a bit better than plastic. So for instance, if you want to use these for hemming, for instance, you want to hem something that is say 3 centimeters, you can just fold the fabric and just gently press it. So obviously don't go crazy with the heat, but I've had great result using this seam tool. And also, of course, if you're having patterns that doesn't have seam allowance, this is also something that we use for that, at least here in Europe, where seam allowance, at least in Scandinavia and Germany and Italy, I think also, and Spain as well. I mean, a lot of European countries by tradition haven't added seam allowance to their pattern. So this was like the first tool when you learn how to sew, you learn how to use this tool to add seam allowance. But I definitely recommend it. There are several different versions of this. I'll see if I can find another one. I'm sure that some of you know this instead, but I bought this and I hate it. And why? Well, because of this. It's like really flimsy. The stopper doesn't stay put, which is supposed to stay put when you're measuring. So, and it's really thin. Like, oh, look at this. It sucks. I'm sure there are a lot better ones, but I was super disappointed with this one, and I much prefer the sturdier ones like this. And I think they're available in the US as well and in other parts of the world. So please tell me if you recognize it. And I also got a phonetic try for how to pronounce seam gauze now in the chat. I will give it a try. Sorry. Seam gauze. Oh my god, that was so embarrassing. Sorry. I need to listen to some YouTube video which talks about this so I can pronounce it correctly the next time. But highly recommended. There are lots of different ways, but it doesn't have to look exactly like this. But the main thing is that it's really small. It has corners and clever shapes for all the different measurements. So this one has 1 centimeters, 1.5 centimeters, 3 centimeters, 2 centimeters, 4 centimeters, and 6 centimeters in just this little piece. It's brilliant. It's genius. And go, it rhymes with cage, so seam gauge. Seam gauge? Oh my god, sorry, it wasn't supposed to be. I will, you please tell me if seam gauge, if that was sounding better than one of my previous attempts. But I will just plug along, and one day I will learn how to pronounce this clever little tool properly. But I think it's German, it's called Pfiffikus anyways, and it's this one is Danish, and it's a thermometer, which is a seam measurement tool basically. Oh, and you said I finally managed to pronounce it right. Thank you so much for the encouragement. It took a while, but that's so nice to have a chat, so people can actually correct you instead of when you're doing a regular YouTube video, which has happened to me many times. For instance, it's hard for me at least to pronounce so. so. It's really hard. I don't know why. So I say that wrong, and that's a bit annoying. As if I talk so much about sewing. I have a tendency of saying sewing like Sue Ellen in Dallas. I don't know why. Or maybe if you're getting sued. That's how I tend to pronounce it, so I apologize in advance if I say that. And now I want to talk about a free tip that I use a lot, and that is using thick paper. I think it's sometimes in the North America called like the back of a legal pad or something like that. Basically, whatever kind of firm paper material you can find. It can be the back of a pizza box, a chocolate box, and there are so many ways to use paper for seaming. And this one, I will just show you a slide now how it works, so just bear with me. So this is something that I use for pressing, and as I said before, pressing against plastic is usually not a good idea, but thick paper works really well. And so I just basically draw a line with the seam allowance for how much I want to press in the fabric, and I use this a lot for knits because knits are super hard to press. Sometimes you want to make more firm pressing on knits, and this is where this kind of paper ruler really comes in handy. So I just draw a line and then press it gently towards that, and you can even go crazy and use some steam as well. It might distort the paper a little bit, but it usually works quite well. And so using paper to shape when pressing is a very inexpensive, basically cheap way of using a tool that doesn't really have to cost anything. And another way that I use paper, I've talked about this before and I've also done a video about it, is this press template. Again, you can use whatever paper you have in handy, and just like I showed you with the other example of the red ruler, is that you use this as a guide when you're doing any kind of patch pockets or anything that needs to be pressed really sharp. Because I'm sure some of you notice if you're doing, for instance, jeans pockets, that sometimes it's kind of hard to get a sharp corner. So I cut these have the finished size of a pocket, not with the seam allowance. So the seam allowance removed, and then I press the seam allowance around the pocket for really razor sharp. I have I thought I have a round, but you can use it for a round pockets. It doesn't really have to be like a jeans pocket. So when anytime you need to press something to look really sharp, cut templates like this out of regular paper, and it's a game changer. At least if you're like me, and I need all the help I can, especially when it comes to finishing, because I'm really struggling, getting something really crisp. Like I think I have some struggles basically with my handling, so I like to use tools to help me get this. If you haven't already, you'll be amazed on how your jeans pockets will look like after you have started using the press templates. So I highly recommend that you try this. Again, I've done a video and a blog post about this as well. The video is probably not very good quality because that was when I just began doing videos on YouTube, but at least it's available, and so you can check that out. I will link that up definitely again also. And there are some other also. Mary Kelly says that she uses cardboard with various measurements. That's excellent. Another way to use cardboard is to use it as a template. If you're making trousers a lot, you will usually probably end up with the same size for the seam allowance for the shape of the seam for the zipper fly. So you can also do a template for that and use that either and trace around it, or if you're feeling brave, just attach it on the fabric and sew along the line of this. So this is another time-saving tool that you can just reuse for as many times as you like. So I have a couple of this one. This one is obviously very tiny because it was a pair of low low waist pants that I use this one for, but I have a bunch of those, and I'm really grateful because they do save a lot of time and makes tracing so much easier. So you can just combine that with some of the tracing pens that we have talked about today. So that's another great way of using. And Tom Tapping says a wooden Tailor clapper is also great for getting sharp seams. This is on my shop list. I was able to try it a while ago, and I now understand why it's so great. Obviously, this is all knowledge that pressing against firm wood is super effective. So I'm really looking forward of getting one of those. Unfortunately, not as budget friendly as paper, so it will probably be something that I will perhaps not buy very soon, but I will definitely invest in one of those. They're also very beautiful, and I'm very jealous of all of you that has one of those clappers, because they are obviously a very excellent tool that is worth investing in. And also, just if you have more things, just tell me in the chat, because I would love to keep them coming now and I can pick them up. One says seam ripper. That is an invaluable tool. I have spent the entire weekend ripping. I had a bit of a disaster happening to me yesterday. I've been so busy working on my upcoming book about sewing activewear, so I haven't actually been sewing for several weeks. So I had a project lying in my stash for like a month. It's a workout top by the pattern maker Fairtrade, Melissa Fair. And I just had basically just finishing the collar and the hemming, so it wasn't much left to do. But then something happened, and I have a photo to show you. So what happened? It was very painful. So some of you might have remembered when you first bought your serger, at least that was something that happened to me a lot when I first started using serger, is that the fabric slip and the serger goes through very important things that shouldn't be sliced. For instance, when I began using a serger, I had a tendency when I was attaching the sleeves to sort of slip and just keep on cutting until the shoulder seams instead. And that hasn't happened to me in many years now, I'm happy to report, until yesterday evening when I was trying to finish the top. I had installed the zippers, the placket, the facing, everything, blah blah blah, and this happened. So I slipped and I cut the zipper in a big chunk and I lost the gripper. No, I forgot the word again. Yeah, that went away in the process. Just slipped away the cracks, and I was actually absolutely mortified because it cut through the seam, it cut through the zipper, it cut through the shield that was supposed to protect the skin, and so I tried to save it using interfacing and zigzag stitches, and it looks like I spent like I have tried and then I tried to sort of re-stitch it, because I had done the entire, it's a quite elaborate work, so I'd done so many details on the top, so just starting from scratch didn't feel all too alluring. And I can show you now, it's a mess. Like you won't see it too much on the webcam that I'm using here, but I will post up photos later on. So there's basically a big stitch here, and I added a shield to this because I have seen that on a bike. I have that on a ready-to-wear bike jersey. So I tried to sort of hide the hole with this, but then I just ended up messing up that seam. So I'm not kidding, I've spent about 4 or 5 hours ripping and restitching, and it still looks not good at all. So that was my weekend sewing disaster. Be careful with the sergers. I think it was because I was really anxious to be like really quick and just make that, so I don't really like to have like projects looming over me. So I did it too late in the evening. Lesson learned. Anyways, it looks alright otherwise, but the problem is it's here, so it's not something that is visible. It's like the biggest thing that you see. But I didn't want to throw the top away either. That felt very how should I put it, wasteful. And now I got some great suggestions here from the chat for tools, so I will read them up here. Christopher says springed scissor and smaller ones to rip seams with. Yeah, that's really good. I've tried those scissors and I think I should start using them instead. And AC use half of a clothespin has a pusher guide for feeding fabric under the foot. Unless I need a specialty foot, I always use a Teflon foot. So that's another way of coming with the issue with the fabric being pushed towards. I've actually just recently bought a Teflon foot because I have a winter sewing machine. The Teflon foot wasn't including, and it's now doesn't even exist for this model anyway. But so I had to buy a copy. But I'm really excited to start trying that one and see how I like it. So thank you. Teflon foot is another great. And the scissor that Christopher talks about is Fisker's Easy Action, worth checking out. And Cynthia has an exciting idea for seam ripping, which is using a razor blade. Does anyone know how to do that? Do you cut in between the layers of fabric? I would love if anyone has any experience of this. That sounds very interesting and a little bit scary, but I'm sure with practice you can make anything work, but it sounds super scary. And Cass says that seam ripper is my most valued tool. Used diligently, it can save your life and your sewing project. When I first started, I used to rip into my material all the time, but I master it now. Yeah, that's very true, especially when you're working with knits. It can be really tricky if you don't be careful when you're using a seam ripper, because you can incidentally ending up ripping threads of the fabric instead of the thread that you have stitched yourself with. And speaking of sergers, Nina says, I hate my serger, but I want to love it. So I'm really curious, Nina, if you want to be more elaborate about that, why you hate your serger. But it is definitely a scary tool, and it's fast, and it's sharp, and it's a wonderful thing to use, I think. I wouldn't want to be without mine, but yeah. It does comes with some casualties for sure. And I mean, I bought my first serger about 15 years ago, and until yesterday evening, I thought that I had finally mastered it, but apparently I wasn't that skilled. And here's another interesting thing. There's a scalpel that is sold as a notion. Since it has a handle, it will probably be safer than a razor blade. That's Mary Rapstead. So that's interesting as well. It's a scalpel as a sewing notions. That sounds really clever. I assume then that it's a really thin precision blade. I think that with practice, my guess is that that kind of tool is actually better for seam ripping than a traditional seam ripper. The advantage of the seam ripper is that it's easy for beginners to learn and master with, but I assume that the kind of more high-tech, sharper tools probably requires more practice. But perhaps once that you master it, it will actually be better than the seam ripper. I would assume that. So great suggestions, keep them coming. I would love to hear more about that. So I will just for this, I just want to show you that sometimes things doesn't go to plan, and my problems when it comes to mistakes is that I get such tunnel vision that I can't really think about anything else. So I was up until 2 o'clock yesterday trying to fix this issue, and when I woke up it felt like I had like a sewing hangover, and instead of doing all the things that I needed to do today, I kept trying to fix the problem, and now I have finally decided that I have to live with this not very pretty neckline, because when you are, especially when you're trying to rip apart knits over and over again, it usually you will end up with holes and also stretch out fabric, so it gets harder and harder to tame each time that you are ripping. So yeah, that was a shame, because as you can see, I worked a lot with the detailing. You know, I done like side panels, I did like a zip pocket in the back and all that. So if I hadn't put all that work into it, I would probably not have bothered trying to save it. So I just need to be like kind to myself now, and not obsessed about it. I just wish it wasn't the first thing I saw, but if I don't look myself into the mirror, this will probably not be such a big issue once I've gotten over the dog feelings that I'm currently feeling about this project. AC also has a great suggestion. I keep a set of dental tools. The little mirror and picks come in hand, and they're inexpensive on Amazon. That sounds really cool. Dental tools, yeah, the picks. Interesting. Great suggestions. And Nina, speaking about serger, she says that I hate to spend an hour to get the seam look right. I sew faster, but with that hour, it's faster to use my regular sewing machine. And I totally understand where you're coming from, because the serger, you have so little control over it, especially when you're still trying to learn it compared to sewing machine. So, for instance, I love my serger for sewing knits, but sometimes when it's things that I need to really control, I actually go to my sewing machine instead, because it's so much easier to manage. So I totally see where you're coming from, but definitely I would encourage you to give your serger like more time, and it will come, and obviously but still, after 12 years or 15 years, it can still mess things up, obviously, for me at least. And AC has something that is called, I also have a hemostat grip. It's a good gripper helper from turning. Mirrored of uses. That's interesting. I'm not really sure what the hemostat grip is. That's probably because my English isn't complete. It's a bit spotty at times. I do have one of these that I also recommend. It's just one of those regular turners that you can use when you're doing any kind of sharp corners, like the points of a collar and things like that. It's a very, very inexpensive tool, and I think it does a good job. So I haven't tried one of those hemostat. And Christopher is also asking for suggestions on any good tweezers, pincettes, and he has lost the one that he was including to the serger, needs a better one. So do tell that, because that's a really good tool as well. Using a tweezer, there are multiple uses for that as well. It's something that I should probably use a lot more as well. I use it for some of the things when it comes to serging, and it's really, really good. And also, as I said, this is something really cheap and definitely worth investing as well. You know, these kind of sharp. So before I used one of these, I used either a screwdriver or a blunt needle, and both didn't work as well as this one. So, and this one's cost pretty much nothing. It's made of some kind of tree. And AC explains here that the hemostat grips are like big tweezers. Interesting. I need to Google that one. Thank you for the suggestions. But it has a surgical grip and it's easy on the hands. That sounds wonderful. Great suggestion. So if you have any more suggestions, please tell me now. I will. The chat will go on now for 5 minutes until it's time to go to bed for me, and hopefully get a better night's sleep this time than I had this night because of my sewing woes. That was a bit of a disaster, but I need to remind myself that when I first began using a serger and sewing more with knits, I had a very low success rate, and but slowly but surely I've really upped that, and I mean, for most part I'm usually able to save most of the garments that I'm doing now, and usually they look according to what I hope. So I need to remind myself that I've done a lot of progress since I started using the serger. So I think it's just temporary mishap. And and Varuna also, that's something for the chat. Varuna asked if it's worth investing in a Tailor ham. I would love to know that too. It's something that I also can see myself investing in the future. And Savannah has a great suggestion for threading serger needles, and she uses floss threaders. That's great, because that's a little bit annoying, especially I find that I'm getting a bit older. On my serger I have the baby lock has an automatic threader function, but my cover stitch machine doesn't, and it's really annoying. So that sounds a great idea. And also Christopher recommends specialty foods. That's a really good idea. It really does help, and I absolutely agree. I've began investing more and more of these, and they do have some practice, require some practice, but they do improve a lot the quality of the sewing once you have learned how to use them. And speaking of Tailor's ham, Howard says that a Tailor ham is a must for pressing curves, so I think we should all add one of those to the wish list. Perhaps you can do those yourself, or maybe I'm just being naive. Also, Howard recommends getting one of those bent nose tweezers, so that's another great suggestion. So if that was all, well, it's about time now to round up the chat. I will keep you updated on my book about sewing activewear. I am working like a dog on that, so I'm kind of a little bit burned out now, but I think it will be out at least in digital form the 12th of December, fingers crossed. I will definitely keep you updated, and you will see all the details, and I will do a video about that as well once I feel confident that I can set a date and say now it will finally be available. And also Christopher here in the chat is also interviewed in the book as one of the makers that I've interviewed. I've done a lot of interviews with everything from professionals to wonderful hobby makers, so there were a lot of inspiring interviews in the book as well. And well, thank you so much for everyone from coming. I love chatting you, and the hour just flew by, and I'm on a high because I love chatting with you, and I've learned so much. And as I said, I will compile all your suggestions, and I just try to capture the chat in some way and compile all your suggestions, add them in the description, so you can go back in a later time and see all the suggestions that we got in the chat. And well, thank you so much, and well, I'll see you next Sunday. Bye bye.